Good afternoon. My presentation, I think, you'll probably find it a little drier and a little dense compared to the previous one. And I'll probably have to go pretty quick to get through it all. But it's about self-sustainability for public banking, short and long-term perspectives. The New York Blood Center is a 501c3 not-for-profit corporation. My presentation includes an overview of the market for cord blood, cost of transplant and prices of cord blood, and bank economics. An overview of cord blood. In the short term, current indications annually, there's about 30,000 patients a year diagnosed with a condition that might require a stem cell transplant. 18,000 of those might be told that they need one that year. 5,400 might find a match from family, and 5,200 could find an unrelated donor. That leaves 7,400 patients each year with no stem cell source available. These are 2011 estimates, and they were cobbled together from a bunch of different sources, but it's representative data. You see in the indications for cord blood, it's hematopoietic reconstitution. And we have a list here of the diseases and conditions that have been treated with cord blood, including mostly your leukemias. Also under evaluation for treatment with cord blood, a number of other conditions, and there's something over 400 ongoing FDA trials using cord blood. This is a map showing the over 4,700 cord blood units that have been shipped by the New York Blood Center since 1993 in over 38 countries around the world. And you've seen some of these slides before. I'd like to point out in the year 2000, there were 528 units shipped. In 2011, there were 4,093. A combined compound annual growth rate of 20%. But I would like to point out something that I think Michael Boo mentioned. The recent trends are definitely flattened. Compare this with the inventory of cord blood in the world. There's over 500,000 cord blood units banked to date. Again, the year 2000, 70,000 units. Year 2011, 506,000. Also a 20% compound annual growth rate. But if you look here, the recent trend is more steep. So if I combine the two and look at shipped units, a key metric for cord blood bankers, shipped units over banked units. So you see on the left, percent sold of inventory, and the years across the bottom that I'm working with, year 2000 to 2011. You can see that it increases up to about 1.2% of inventory per year, and then it decreases over the last few years down to 0.8% of inventory. This is worldwide using WMDA data. We'll come back to this a little bit later. So the worldwide cord blood market, you can see here cord blood is in the green line. It's being collected and used and shipped throughout the world. And slides that, again, Michael Boo has shown, about 1/3 of the cord blood units are shipped internationally. And you can see the usage of the cord blood units, 1758 is the largest in one country, the USA. Japan is very notable here, and I want to point this out for later. I'll come back to it. But you see that it's the US, Asia, and then Europe. So on this slide, I'm just pointing out here representative data again. Europe would be a net importer of cord blood, importing 400 units and exporting 286. North America is a net exporter, exporting 518 units, importing 267. If you look at Asia, it's basically net zero. They're importing and exporting about the same amount. So that has to do with Japan. So I had some slides here from Suneo Takahashi, who is a researcher at our institution. That's their national mascot for the Japanese cord blood banks. I'd pronounce his name, but I can't do it. So they have 11 cord blood banks and over 220 registered cord blood transplant facilities in Japan. And the size of the inventory, 2010, was 32,000 units, and they had transplanted 6,000 units. That's quite a high percentage. So if we go back to the key metric of shipped units over banked units, in the worldwide data, that was 4,093 transplants over 506 units, 0.8%. But in Japan, the year before, it was 1,056 transplants over 32,000, 3.25%. It's quite a big difference. That's thought to be a combination of patient size and homogeneity of HLA types, but irrespective of the reason, it's a little bit worse than we thought for the rest of the world. So back to the original slide I showed. What happens here for the rest of the world, everything shifts down, and actually it's 1% in 2008 and down to 0.6% in more recent years. So the question is, what affects this key metric of shipped per banked units? And again, as discussed a little bit earlier today, answer is bigger units sell at a higher frequency. That's that TNC count. So here's a graph showing inventory levels in the bar chart and the metric of shipped over inventory in the yellow and green lines. This shows actually the New York inventory and the NMDP inventories. So all the way to the left, the red and the blue are the number of units in inventory that are less than 900 million cells. The next grouping is 900 million to 1.2 billion and so on. And you can see the inventory is clustered to the left, and all the way on the right, above 3 billion cells, you don't really see very many units at all. So you can see, though, it's clear that the smaller units sell at a much lower pace, and when you get up to that 3 billion cell count, you're looking at selling 20% of your inventory, which is a key piece of data. This is confirmed by BMDW data. Same thing. You're selling 1% of your units that are at 1.25, and above 3 billion cells, you're at 17%. The effect of this is a slide here prepared by Michael Boo again. 82% of all 2009 shipments came from 29% of the available inventory. The same data looked at from WMDA, updated for 2011, 76% of all shipments came from 25% of the available inventory. So the recommendation has been bank-only units with a TNC greater than 1.25 or maybe higher. That will definitely come back to in a few minutes. Cost of transplant and prices of cord blood units. You see in this slide, I think it just shows that there's competition for sources of stem cells. I did a little bit of a literature search and found a couple of interesting articles, cost of pediatric allogeneic hematopoietic cell transplantation and the economics of the same. So, cost data. Median total cost for umbilical cord blood transplant was $137,081 to $256, compared with $83,000 for match-related donor transplant. This includes costs of graft, lab services, radiological, pharmacy services, room and board, blood components, and other services. It does not include the cost of physician services. The second article, similar data, autologous transplants 36 to 88,000, and allogeneic 96 to 204. And they did note that the cost can vary quite a bit with these characteristics: patient characteristics, transplant center experience, conditioning, graft type, duration of hospitalization, relapse, and complications. So I'm sorry, I'm going to prices now. So this is cord blood bank pricing. So this is CBU, the cost to procure a graft, 33 banks in the years 2008 and the year 2011. So across the bottom you see bank 1, bank 2, bank 3, bank 4. And on the left axis you see prices. So in the blue line is 2008 prices. So those prices range from a little less than 15,000 to up on the right above 40,000. An average price of just over 30,000 in 2008. 2011, those prices increased. That line is jagged because not all banks increased their price by the same amount over that period of time, but the average is just under 40,000. So what we've seen is, in that same period, an increase of 20 to 25% in the last 3 years. So the costs of estimates for worldwide usage, there were, in 2010, 3,425 patients and 4,054 cord blood units. The disparity is because of the double cord transplants. So transplant costs would range from $328 million to $698 million, and the cord blood unit cost would range from $140 to $160 million. I recognize that this is representative only because these are U.S. costs applied to worldwide transplants, and it's not quite the same, but it's representative. So bank economics, costs and revenues. So bank costs include collection, volume reduction, centrifugation, cryopreservation, freezing, storage, and testing. This is representative of, in our model, we use staff collection model, not an obstetrician collection model. So we have had staff in 9 different hospitals in recent years. This is a list of all the testing that is required to release a cord blood unit to search, and all these tests cost money. Some of them we do in-house and some of them we outsource, but they all cost. And this is a finished product image. And all the costs are incurred at this point except for the long-term storage costs, which is facilities, freezers, maintenance, liquid nitrogen. So it took me a while, but I got back to the recommendation to bank-only units with 1.25 billion cells. This is a little graphic to explain the cord blood value chain. So if we have a birth census in a hospital we're collecting of, it's 100%. It's the census, the number of babies being born. We may have losses where we do not get units because maybe we don't have shift coverage, maybe we don't collect on the weekends. We may have mothers that refuse permission for this. We may have private collections, which of course are not publicly banked, and we might have other medical conditions or other exclusions. So we actually harvest X% of that census. Of that harvested percent, sometimes you don't get enough just volume in the bag. So you're not going to proceed with those and you lose some there. You raise that, we call it the Tnc throttle. At 1.25 billion cells, you're cutting off a bunch of units, and we would use those for research, and we could provide those for research use. But you could twist that throttle any way you want. You're going to basically reduce your throughput to that Y% of the original census. On that Y%, you're going to incur costs of processing, testing, and typing. You're also going to have some additional losses due to refusals or IDM reactive or contaminated units. And finally, you get banked units at Z% of census. The point is that it doesn't matter what the cutoff is, there are fixed costs that just don't go away. So fixed costs could be labor, for us anyway, labor in the hospitals, labor at the bank, equipment costs, overhead, et cetera. Whereas the variable costs could be collection bags, reagents, processing bags, other supplies, shipping and testing. So this is a little bit of a complicated graph, but I wanted to explain per unit banked. The red line is variable cost per unit. So across the bottom you have number of units collected, and across the left you have cost per unit on the left axis. So the red line is flat, it's variable cost per unit. No matter how many units you bring in, it still costs the same amount per unit. The fixed cost per unit in the purple line looks like it varies, but basically you're spreading out the same fixed costs over more or less units. So it changes. So the blue line is the total cost per unit. The green line is the interesting one. It's the revenue per unit. And it's based on that earlier metric that I talked about, shipped over banked units. If you collect 100 units, you might sell, if you're selling 1%, you sell 1 unit. But the next year you might sell another unit. The next year you might sell another unit. So the revenue is stretched out over a number of years. But if you make that projection and use discount cash flow and bring it back to today's dollars, you can make a revenue per unit banked figure. And the point here is that this is a theoretical break-even for your bank. So to try to explain the Tnc cutoff, what happens when you raise the Tnc cutoff? If you're collecting, say, 10,000 units a year, you're right there at that blue line. You are below the green line, so in theory, you're in a profitable zone. If you raise the cutoff, you're going to collect fewer units. You're going to then travel up the cost line, and your fixed cost is going to be spread out amongst fewer units. So your costs are going to go up on a per unit basis. And what you're hoping is that just because you're collecting the larger units, your revenue per unit is also going to go up. But it's a dicey game when the marketplace changes so fast in cord blood, and when there's so many additional banks starting and additional units in the inventory. So in order to do this, you need to be able to predict your sales. How many cord blood units are you going to sell next year or the year after? So looking at that, how do we sell cord blood units? Since '93, people have always been able to get cord blood units for the New York Blood Center via fax communication. In addition, we were able to list our units on BMDW, and then the units could be searched in the BMDW registry. NMDP and the single point of access could have access through faxes, but we did make a computer connection called distributed search so that all of our units are available as well through Traxis. And in addition, we have our own in-house web search, which is the way we directly distribute cord blood units to transplant centers. So to predict future sales, what do? We looked at those distribution channels, and we did quantitative techniques, multi-factor modeling, Monte Carlo simulation scenarios. Here's some small graphs so that you can't read them. But we are aware that the Tnc count is definitely a good predictor of the number of sales that you'll have in your bank. There are recent trends and qualitative factors. So there are the other sources of stem cells, haploidentical transplants and the uptick in those. Cord blood usage is certainly seen to plateau worldwide. And there's an ever increasing number of competing units and banks. So that means there's more 4 out of 6 and 5 out of 6 matches available, and the choice and the competition comes down primarily based on the TNC of the unit. This is helped by better access to all the competing units through the SPA or larger registries. But I guess in the longer term, back to my original slide, there's still over 7,000 patients each year with no stem cell source available. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know whether to be encouraged or discouraged by the data you just presented, but let's open it up to questions and see how people feel about it. Do we have any questions for Michael? Okay, well, yes, Karen.
That's a good doctor system. So supposing clinical trials completely change the landscape and small units are usable, doesn't that completely change everybody's thinking? I mean, what about these trials that are co-infusing 2 different graft sources? I mean, if the small inventory becomes usable, do things change?
The answer is yes. I would add to it that I'm not a physician, but I would say that that there's always been studies looking at match level or mismatch level versus size of unit, and there's always been a debate. But if you did take away, TNC as a primary selector, people would start looking at match level more closely. And there's things like the non-inherited maternal antigen or other methods where you could look at better matching facilities that could lead to better outcomes. So absolutely, if that kind of expansion were to work, that would be a game changer.
Yeah, Karen, your question is a very good one, I think. And the model that you built is it's a robust model, at least that's one I could tell, but it's a static model. There are a couple of factors from my perspective. So I'm leading into a question here, and it's following on from Karen. There's a couple of factors that you need to build in. One is the increased demand. What's going to happen, the demand for cord blood units in the future, both as a result of the clinical trial activity that Karen's mentioned, or from other technology breakthroughs. And the technology breakthroughs could be technologies for expansion that are effective that allow the smaller units to be used, or other uses for the tissue in the banks. Right. There's a number of clinical trials out there right now that are looking at whether you can take cord blood units and turn them into transplantable red blood cell units or plasma. if that happens, if that technology ends up getting developed, and there are 3 or 4 groups working on it pretty actively, you now have a whole new market for that tissue at the bottom end, which will underwrite your cost of collecting on the top end, right?
That's right. I think maybe from the earlier talk from the gentleman regarding venture capital, I think some of the things that you described, you call it a static model, but it's really the model in which we are working in right now.
Yeah.
And some of the things you're talking about from a financial perspective are a little bit more on the speculative or investment side.
Right.
So a gentleman in venture capital might look at that revenue model and say, okay, I'm going to take that revenue model and take 50% of it, and it maybe works. But I think
at least
I think I didn't add too much about that in my presentation, but I think that additional uses for banked inventory would also be significant.
And whether you buy the model or not, I think that for anybody in the public banking business, you have to find some uses for that tissue. You've been storing tissue for 10, 15, 20 years, and you're now finding that at least half of your inventory, for some of you, 2/3 of your inventory is not usable because it doesn't meet the current TNC thresholds. So that tissue is either going to sit there dormant at an extraordinarily low utilization rate, or you got to find something else to do with it. Now, if we get a breakthrough in expansion technologies, and I think, frankly, we're reasonably close to the technology side, we still have the clinical program to do on the top of it, but on the technology side, there are at least 4 or 5 groups, and we're going to hear about that tomorrow, working on expansion, and we're seeing multiples of between 3 and 25, and I don't know whether you can believe the data, you can judge for yourself tomorrow, but people are working on expansion technologies that don't just expand the volume of the blood, but actually expand the CD34 cells and the other cells that provide therapeutic value. If one or more of those technologies hits the market, meaning they've matured the technology and they're able to get it through an FDA clinical trial so that it becomes standard of care, that dramatically changes this whole set of equations because it makes the lower units in the public banks now readily available for transplant. And that could be a game changer for the field as a whole. And then if any of the 400 or 600 clinical trials that are out there working on new therapies get over the goal line, you're now going to have a dramatic increase in that demand. And frankly, even at the existing demand, you have a demand curve here, 7,000. On your numbers, you have 7,000 patients out of 18,000 that are looking for cord blood units and can't find it. So you've got a significant market demand. There's just a discontinuity now between what's in the banks and meeting that demand, and that's going to be the challenge of the bank operators to close the gap on that discontinuity. So.
From your lips to God's ears. And,
I wish.
But second, just a couple quick things. I would say that the point about the older inventory of the smaller size not necessarily being that useful today. One good thing about it is that you did invest the money in those units and they're in the freezer, and it costs $20-something a year in liquid nitrogen to keep them there. We had a unit ship out a few months back that was collected 18 years ago for clinical use.
Right.
And so, you could pay for a lot of storage of older units if you sell one of them. The second thing is I think I'd love to talk to you about some of those additional uses. What we're trying to do is figure out how many units are we going to collect next year. Yeah. And so that's a very specific type of a question.
Well, you've theorized, let me ask you a very direct question. You've theorized 125 TNC count threshold. Is that the threshold you guys are using?
Actually, we put in, we talked about that quite a bit. And what we did was we put in we built into our SOPs a flexible threshold. And we actually, that little graphic with the throttle, we actually are able to throttle the number of units we bank based on what our financial conditions are. We don't usually change it more than monthly. But we also put in two cutoffs, one at the hospital, because we measure it at the hospital, and also one after we process, because we look at processing losses. So 1.25, I think, is a number that we have used. We've been above that and we've been below it.
Sure.
And it all just depends on how many units you think you want to bank.
Sure. Okay. All right. Good. Any other questions? Yeah.
On that, would you consider adding an additional throttle for CD34 as well then? So.
Yeah, we spoke to some of, or we've heard from some of our colleagues in Barcelona, and in some of the ways they do it, and I think we would. I think what we're looking at doing is we're kind of playing with that we're kind of playing with that. It all has to do with the timing, and right now it's easy for us to get, you know, TNC immediately, and so we'll use that, but I agree with you.
Okay. All right. All right, thanks, Michael.